Imagine being 12 years old, sitting in a classroom that smells like dry markers and paper. Your backpack's still new. Your nerves already tight because it's the first week of school. Attendance is being called, one name at a time. And you're half listening, half daydreaming. Until suddenly, everything stops. The teacher pauses. The room goes quiet. And in that silence, you realize the next sound you hear might decide whether you're seen or erased. That was the moment I learned how easily someone in power can decide. Your identity doesn't matter. And that was the moment this story truly began. If you've ever had someone disrespect you simply because it was easier than trying. If you've ever been made to feel small by someone who thought their authority excused their behavior, then this story is for you. Before we dive deeper, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and settle in. Because this isn't a loud revenge story. It's a slow one, a quiet one. And sometimes, those are the most satisfying. I was in 6th grade when this happened. I went to a private school, the kind people assume is polished and progressive. And honestly, in many ways, it was. The student body was incredibly diverse. Different ethnicities, different cultures, different accents, different traditions. You heard all kinds of names every single day. Names that didn't fit neatly into English phonetics. And nobody made a big deal out of it. At least, nobody had. Until her name was Ms. White. Yes, that was really her name. And from the moment she walked into the classroom, she carried herself like rules mattered more than people. She was strict in a way that didn't feel fair. Structured in a way that didn't feel safe. Her posture was always rigid. Her expressions, controlled. Her voice sharp but not loud. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. She had the kind of authority that assumed obedience without discussion. Now, my name is Cowie. It's Hawaiian. It's not trendy or invented or chosen on a whim. It has weight. It has history. Both sides of my family had lived in Hawaii for over 3 generations. To the land my family called home long before I was born. And yes, when you look at it on paper, it can seem intimidating. But it really isn't. K-A-U-E. 3 sounds. No tricks. No guesswork. On the first day of class, Ms. White started calling attendance. One by one, names flowed easily. She barely hesitated. Then she reached mine. She stopped. Her eyebrows knit together, her mouth tightened, and she leaned back slightly, like my name had personally inconvenienced her. She tried once, badly. She tried again, worse. And before I could even finish inhaling to help her, I spoke up, polite, practiced. The way kids with uncommon names learn to be early in life. Oh, it's pronounced Ka-E-E. What she did next didn't feel real at first. She didn't repeat it. She didn't ask me to say it again. She didn't smile or nod or make any effort at all. Instead, she waved her hand dismissively and said, I'll just call you Catherine. That was it. No question. No discussion. No permission. For a moment, my brain froze. I remember staring at her, waiting for the joke, waiting for her to correct herself, waiting for literally anything that would make this make sense. But nothing came. The classroom was quiet. The kind of quiet where you can feel eyes on you without seeing them. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My hands went cold. And my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step going downstairs. Teachers mispronouncing names. I was used to that. Teachers butchering names. Annoying, but common. But this was different. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't ignorance. This was a decision. She decided my name wasn't worth learning. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her again. Not because I agreed, but because I was 12 years old, standing alone, and she was the adult with authority. And for the first 2 weeks, I let it happen. Every morning, Catherine. Every worksheet, Catherine. Every time she called on me, that name echoed again, foreign and unwanted. Each time felt like a small cut. Not deep enough to bleed, but deep enough to sting. Over and over. What hurt the most wasn't just the name. It was how casual she was about it. Like my identity was optional. Like respect was something I hadn't earned yet. She never asked if I preferred a nickname. Never asked for my middle name. Never tried again. It was easier for her to rename me than to respect me. At home, my family said my name the way it was meant to be said. Soft, familiar, real. At school, I became someone else. Someone she chose. And slowly, quietly, something inside me began to change. Because I realized this wasn't just about pronunciation. It was about power. And once I understood that, I knew I wasn't going to let it slide forever. By the third week, it wasn't just annoying anymore. It was exhausting. Every time, she said, Catherine, my body reacted before my brain did. My shoulders would tense. My jaw would tighten. There was this tiny pause inside me where I'd have to remind myself she was talking to me. It sounds small when you say it out loud. But when it happens 5 days a week, multiple times a day, it starts to mess with your sense of self. It starts to feel like you're disappearing in pieces. What made it worse was that Ms. White wasn't openly cruel. If she had been yelling or mocking me, it would have been easier to label her a villain. But she wasn't dramatic. She was calm, controlled, polite, even, and that's what made it so infuriating. Because when someone hurts you quietly, it's harder to prove they're hurting you at all. Every time she said my fake name, she said it like it was perfectly reasonable. Like I was the one being dramatic for feeling upset. I started noticing patterns. She had no problem learning difficult last names. She stumbled, sure, but she tried. She corrected herself. She practiced, but with me, there was no effort. No second attempt. No interest. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. Every Catherine started sounding less like a name and more like a reminder. I don't need to meet you halfway. One day, I finally worked up the courage to quietly correct her again after class. My voice shook, but I kept it polite. I told her, gently, that I really preferred my actual name. She looked at me the way people look at problems they don't want to deal with, not angry, just annoyed. She sighed, gave a tight smile, and said something along the lines of, "It's just easier this way. You'll get used to it." Then she turned back to her desk. That sentence stuck with me. You'll get used to it. That was the moment something snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a clean break inside my chest. Because I realized she wasn't confused. She wasn't forgetful. She was comfortable. Comfortable dismissing me? Comfortable deciding for me. Comfortable assuming I'd eventually shrink myself to fit her convenience. And that's when the idea planted itself. It wasn't revenge at first. It was curiosity. A quiet thought that crept in during class. While she was explaining fractions on the board, I watched how every student addressed her the same way. Ms. White, always. Respectful. Automatic. Even the other teachers called her Ms. White. Her title was part of her armor. It reinforced her authority. And then I wondered, what would happen if I took that away? I didn't act on it immediately. I thought about it for days. Waited. Tested it in my head. Because I knew what I was doing if I went through with it. I wasn't trying to be loud. I wasn't trying to get attention. I wanted symmetry. If she could decide my name didn't matter, then neither did hers. So, I did some digging. I found her first name in an old yearbook from the year before. There it was, printed clearly under her stiff school photo. Jessica. Just Jessica. Seeing it felt oddly powerful, like uncovering a secret she assumed no one would use. The next morning, my heart was pounding harder than it ever had in math class. I waited. My hands were sweating. I barely heard the lesson. And then she called on me. Catherine, what's the answer to number 3? And before I could overthink it, before fear could stop me, the word slipped out of my mouth, calm and clear. Jessica, I don't understand how you got that answer. The room froze. She stopped mid, slowly turned toward me. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Not angry. Surprised. She corrected me immediately. That's Miss White. Her tone was sharp, but controlled. I nodded like I accepted it. Then repeated myself. Jessica, could you explain it again? Something flickered across her face. Irritation. Disbelief. Maybe. Even a little shock. But she didn't yell. She didn't punish me. She just corrected me again and continued the lesson. And I sat there, heart racing, realizing something important. She hated it. And more importantly, She couldn't stop me. From that day on, I never used her title again. Sometimes it was Jessica. Sometimes Jess. Sometimes Jessie. Sometimes JJ. Every variation felt like a mirror held up to her own behavior. And every time she corrected me, I ignored it the same way she ignored me. Calm, casual, consistent. And slowly, quietly, the power dynamic started to crack. After that first time, I expected consequences. Detention. A call home. Public embarrassment. Something. But none of that happened. Ms. White corrected me every single time. Her voice clipped and precise. That's Ms. White. And every single time I ignored it, like I hadn't even heard her. I'd repeat my question calmly, using her first name again. And she would sigh internally and move on. That silence became the battlefield. No yelling, no confrontation. Just two people refusing to budge. And somehow, that made it worse for her. What surprised me most was how quickly it became routine. The fear I felt that first day faded into something steadier. Confidence, maybe, or clarity. Because once you realize someone can't actually hurt you for standing your ground, it becomes easier to keep doing it. Every time she said, Catherine, I heard it less and less as a name and more as a choice she was making. And every time I said Jessica, it felt like I was refusing to disappear. The classroom started to feel different. I noticed it in small ways at first. A couple of kids would glance at me when I spoke. Some would look at her. No one laughed, but there was a quiet awareness spreading. Like everyone sensed, something was off. Ms. White's corrections became sharper, faster, more irritated, but still controlled. She never slipped, never raised her voice. She was too careful for that. But irritation has a way of leaking through even the tightest control. She also started calling on me less. I noticed that too. If my hand went up, she'd scan the room and pick someone else. When she did have to address me, she'd say Catherine with extra emphasis. Like forcing the word into place. It felt deliberate now, almost spiteful. And that confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about pronunciation. This was about control. There were days I doubted myself. Days I wondered if I was being disrespectful. After all, she was the teacher. I was the student. That's what we're taught, right? But then I'd think about how easily she could have avoided all of this. One question, one attempt, 1 ounce of effort. And she chose not to. That thought grounded me every time the guilt crept in. What really cemented everything was how she reacted to nicknames. When I started switching it up, Jess one day, Jessie the next. JJ, when I was feeling bold, I could see it hit her differently. Her jaw would tighten just slightly. Her pen would pause midair. Because now she knew exactly how it felt. To be renamed without consent. To be reduced to something easier for someone else. And still, she never punished me. I think she knew that if she did, she'd have to explain why it bothered her so much. She'd have to admit that names mattered. And that would open the door to admitting she was wrong. So instead, she endured it, day after day, the same way she expected me to endure being Catherine. By spring, it wasn't just between us anymore. Other students started whispering about it. Quiet comments, side glances. A few even smiled when I spoke up in class. I wasn't loud. I wasn't rude. I was consistent. And consistency is powerful, especially when someone in authority realizes they can't bend you without exposing themselves. I didn't feel angry anymore. That was the strangest part. I felt calm, centered. Like I had reclaimed something that belonged to me. My name was still Cowie to the people who mattered. And in that classroom, even if she refused to say it, I made sure she felt what it was like to have her identity ignored. And that's when I realized this wasn't just revenge anymore. It was balance. By the time winter melted into spring, the dynamic in that classroom had quietly but completely shifted. On the surface, everything looked the same. Ms. White still stood at the front of the room. Chalk in hand, posture stiff, voice measured. She still enforced rules, still collected homework, still corrected answers. But beneath that rigid exterior, there was tension, and everyone could feel it. It hung in the air like static, especially whenever she had to acknowledge me. She never stopped calling me Catherine. In fact, if anything, she leaned into it harder. She said it slower, firmer, like she was trying to overwrite something by force. But the more she insisted, the more obvious it became that this wasn't about ease anymore. It was about refusing to admit she'd crossed a line. And every time she said it, I answered to it, without acknowledging it as my name. Like I was responding out of politeness, not recognition. Meanwhile, I never let up. Every question, every clarification, every time I needed help, I used her first name. Sometimes it was Jessica, clean and direct. Other times it was Jess or Jessie, casual and light. The nicknames weren't loud or mocking. That was the genius of it. They sounded harmless, friendly, even, which made them impossible to discipline without looking unreasonable. She corrected me every single time. "That's Miss White." Always the same tone, calm/professional. But there was a fraction of a second after each correction, where you could see it hit her. The pause, the tightening of her jaw, the way she'd inhale just a little deeper before continuing. Those moments were small, but they were everything. They told me she felt it. Other students noticed too. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way people notice patterns they can't ignore anymore. Eyes would flick between us when I spoke. A few kids smirked. Others looked uncomfortable. Some looked impressed. No one ever said anything out loud, but the awareness spread. And once a room becomes aware of a power struggle, authority doesn't feel quite as solid anymore. She started avoiding me whenever she could. If my hand went up, she'd pretend not to see it. If she needed someone to demonstrate a problem, she'd pick literally anyone else. But avoidance has limits. Eventually, she had to acknowledge me. And every time she did, the same ritual played out. Catherine. Correction. Ignore. Jessica. Explanation. Move on. The most telling moments weren't loud. They were quiet. Like when she'd hand back a test and pause just a beat too long at my desk. Or when she'd write my grade down with unnecessary force, pressing the pen into the paper like she was trying to leave a mark. Once, I caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Not annoyed, just calculating, like she was trying to figure out why this bothered her so much. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't just annoyed. She felt challenged. I was mirroring her behavior back at her, calmly, consistently, without emotion. And she had no defense against that, without admitting the original offense. By the end of the year, the exhaustion showed. She corrected me automatically now, almost reflexively, like a habit she couldn't break. But the edge in her voice was gone, replaced by something else, or the quiet understanding that she hadn't won this. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel smug. I felt steady, grounded, like I had held on to something important without letting it turn me into someone ugly. I never yelled, never mocked, never escalated. I simply refused to be renamed without consent. And in doing so, I learned something most adults don't learn until much later. The school year ended the way it had unfolded quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No apology. No victory speech. On the last day of class, Ms. White handed back our final papers and said my fake name, with the same practiced firmness she'd used all year. I answered, packed my bag, and walked out of that classroom knowing something important had shifted. Even if it would never be acknowledged out loud, I didn't need her validation anymore. I had already reclaimed what mattered. I learned early that authority doesn't always equal correctness. Sometimes, the most powerful form of resistance is consistency, refusing to bend when someone expects you to fold. I never corrected her publicly again. I never escalated. I simply held my ground. And in doing so, I preserved my dignity without losing myself. 2 years later, I heard through the grapevine that Ms. White had been fired. Not for one big scandal. Not for a loud meltdown. But for a pattern. Finally became impossible to ignore. When I heard that, I wasn't shocked. Because what she did to me wasn't isolated. It wasn't accidental. That the discomfort I felt wasn't imagined. That names matter. That identity matters. And that when someone refuses to see you, it's okay to stop seeing them the way they demand to be seen. I still love my name. I always will. It connects me to my family, my culture, and my history in a way no substitute ever could. And while she never learned to say it, She did teach me something else: how to stand firm without becoming cruel, how to mirror disrespect without stooping to it, and how quiet resistance can be louder than shouting. So if you're listening to this and you've ever had someone dismiss a part of you because it was inconvenient, respect goes both ways. And sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance carry the longest echoes. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button. Most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed. Because sometimes, the sweetest payback doesn't come with noise. It comes with consistency.